we've decided that, going forward, the moment focus on the education basics around hydration, nutrition is actually probably far more important for the average person, be it a little bit less sexy and a little bit less, marketable. It is ultimately probably where most people can find the biggest performance gains.
That Triathlon Show 280. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode I interview Andy Blow, who is the founder of Precision Hydration. He is back to revisit the topic of hydration and nutrition strategies for triathlon and endurance events and races. And in this interview, Andy discusses plenty of practical and actionable ways that can help you get your hydration and nutrition strategy right for race day so that you can have as good a chance as possible of not letting that ruin your race, which unfortunately happens to a lot of athletes. Before we get into the interview, big thanks to our sponsors. And as you know, Precision Hydration is one of the sponsors for this episode. And I think that this interview with Andy really goes a long way to show why I admire Precision Hydration as a company, because it's very clear that their goal here is to help people and educate people. And they do a really good job of that with podcast interviews on this podcast and on other podcasts as well, on their blog, their newsletter, and their social media. It's always filled with really good practical advice that you can actually implement in your training and racing. And as Andy himself mentions in this interview, once we get into it, not everybody is going to need to replace sodium and electrolytes in their events. So it's not as if they're trying to sell everybody on their products. But for those that do, if you want to try Precision Hydration's specific sodium and electrolyte products, then you can use the promo code That Triathlon Show 15 to get 15% off your entire order, or try your first box for free with the promo code That Triathlon Show, all caps. And big thanks, as usual, to Roka, who is also sponsoring this episode. Roka has several patented technologies, and perhaps the most famous one is their arms up technology that they use in all of their wetsuits, from the entry level to the Maverick X line. And they also use it in their tri-suits. So when you use a Roka tri-suit and a Roka wetsuit, you can make sure that your mobility during the swim leg of the triathlon is going to be performed with as much mobility as you can possibly muster. And the arms up technology is just one example of how innovative and technologically advanced Roka's products are. They really go to the nth degree to make sure that they produce top-class products that are designed to make you as fast as possible in your race. You can get 20% off your order with the promo code TTS20 on roka.com. And I forgot to mention Precision Hydration's URL, and that's of course, precisionhydration.com. So there we go. Let's get into the interview with Andy Blow. Welcome back, Andy, to That Triathlon Show. How are things going?
Really good, thanks, Michael. I'm just, like you, surviving the Northern European winter, but I am going to Australia next week, so I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, and the week after that, I'm going to Portugal. So I guess we just have to hang in there a little bit more.
Exactly.
For both of us. So let's get right into the topics that we have on store, because we have quite a lot for today. And the first thing that I wanted to tackle is to just revisiting the basics, because it's been quite some time since we did that. We have a lot of new listeners. I just talked about that before we started recording. So can you talk about the sweat rates, sweat sodium concentration differences that exist between individuals, and why that is important to consider and plan for, especially in longer and hotter races?
Yeah, I think, definitely one of the things that always seems to get overlooked for whatever reason, or often gets overlooked in planning nutrition hydration strategies, is the level of individual variation that occurs between different people. And whilst a lot of people can get away with, probably following a generic or the same kind of nutrition plan if they're only doing short or light events or events that are in moderate environmental conditions, when you start to go out and do very long events or events in extreme heat or things where you're pushing yourself really, really hard for an extended period of time, what are small differences or even moderate differences in physiology, for example, like in sweat rate or sweat sodium composition, can be multiplied out over a number of hours to create vast differences in what individual athletes need. And I think it's a continuing struggle to sometimes, educate people on the range of those needs and then how to go about identifying what you need to do to make it work for yourself and your own situation.
So we have both the fluid needs, obviously, but also the sodium needs. And if we cover those one at a time, like starting with fluid, for example, what might the inter-individual differences be in how much you lose, how much sweat you lose, simply, and how much should you try to restore, because you might not be able to restore all of that if you're in a hot race and you're sweating buckets.
Definitely. So the range of difference in fluid loss is dramatic between people and in different situations. And I think if you really want to look at the extremes, in certain situations, in very cold conditions, athlete sweat rates on an hourly basis, especially in a longer event where the intensity isn't super high, can become extremely low. You might find that you're losing only a few low hundreds of milliliters of sweat per hour. I know that there's a good example of that in Alan Hovda, who we've started working with over the last year or so, who's won the Norseman a number of times, and he's done that race in very variable weather conditions and reported extremely low sweat losses when the weather was effectively around freezing 0 degrees Celsius on the bike ride, and compared with what it could be if it's up in the teens in Celsius, which I guess would be in the 50s, 60s, maybe 70s Fahrenheit. So the lower end is almost like only a little bit more than zero. But at the higher end, some people can lose. We've measured athletes losing in excess of 3 litres an hour during exercise. And I would say, that's more than 3 litres an hour is rare, but more than 2 litres an hour is not so rare in people, say doing an Ironman in very hot weather who are fit and working hard. The average is often quoted as being around 1 to 1.2 litres per hour, but that span is pretty wide. And interestingly, once you get above about 1.2 litres an hour of loss, regardless of anything else, your gastric emptying rate and your fluid absorption rate is probably not going to keep up with those losses. So you are going to run some sort of deficit, even if you drink as much as you physically can absorb. And then, as you pointed out, the next question therefore is then, okay, well, how much should you replace? And again, that is a complicated question, because I think if you're someone who's losing 2.5, 3 litres an hour in terms of sweat, then if you're only absorbing 1.2 litres per hour, it's very easy to run up a pretty significant fluid deficit quite quickly. So for those people who are losing a lot of sweat, their mission, if you like, is to try to absorb as much as they possibly can, because they are just fighting a losing battle. For other people whose losses are more moderate, it can be a little bit more. It becomes possible for them to overshoot, and therefore being a little bit more conservative in what they try to take in is probably is more prudent. So a lot of our recommendations with people start somewhere between, let's say, 4 to 500 milliliters per hour at the lower end for longer and hotter events, up to about 1 to 1.2 liters an hour as being a comfortable window that most people would sit within. But we always have to emphasize that within that there's a bit of variation and quite a lot of trial and error needed to actually dial those numbers in exactly.
And in terms of dialing those numbers in, is your general recommendation that each athlete should test themselves in conditions that are simulating their expected race conditions? Or do you think that based on just, I guess, like for example, indoor training and getting a general feel for how much you sweat, you can have a guess at whether you should be at the lower end or the higher end or somewhere in the middle of that 0.5 to 1.2 liter range.
Yeah, specificity is always the best if you can do it. So if you can go out and reliably ride or run in conditions that simulate those that you're going to race in, similar clothing, similar intensity, that sort of thing, then you're going to get the most accurate picture that you can of what you might potentially lose during a race. And then that gives you a pretty decent figure to work off. Okay, if I'm losing 1.5 litres an hour, how does it feel if I'm replacing 1 litre an hour, or so on and so forth. And to be honest with you, the most diligent and often some of the more successful athletes we work with, especially those that are having issues with this, that's the approach they take. They really work hard to simulate those conditions and get a feel for it. There are occasions, though, where, let's say, taking your example, you're in Finland at the moment, and if you were going to prep almost entirely for Kona training in Finland, it's going to be very hard for you to actually go outdoors and simulate any kind of weather conditions that are going to be close to what you're likely to experience there. And that's when maybe training indoors and getting a feel for what your sweat rates are like in a more simulated condition, or even just a more oppressive condition indoors is probably the next best thing. Alternatively, because there are a lot of athletes that just aren't so interested or so willing to go to the depths of doing this kind of, sweat rate analysis on themselves and all the rest of it, what I would say is that the very least that you can do is start to record how much you are drinking during harder training sessions and races, comparing that with performance. And that is ultimately what we're most interested in, because although monitoring changes in body weight is interesting and can indicate things, ultimately it's about performance. And certainly one of the things we do increasingly with the pro athletes we're working with is encourage them to record as diligently as possible their fluid intakes during hard simulation training sessions and during races, and then trying to compare that against performance, against any GI distress and other things, to build up a picture of and the weather conditions, so we can say, in these conditions, this level of fluid consumption seems to work or doesn't, and we can test and adjust from there.
Yeah, that is good advice. Do you, the professionals and maybe really serious age groupers that you work with, do you recommend that they go out and repeatedly try to get a feel for the range of difference in sweat loss from day to day? And does this exist, like a difference from day to day in sweat loss, or is it pretty similar if we assume that the conditions and clothing and such are similar?
I think if you control the variables, and the variables that really impact this are going to be the environmental conditions, so both heat and humidity, and if you're outside, wind as well, the clothing and the intensity, probably also the duration, of course. If those factors are controlled, once you know what your figures are like in certain conditions, they don't seem to deviate a lot. With a bit of heat acclimation, sometimes sweat rates go up. But with a lot of athletes, we see that shift being relatively minor, because a lot of athletes are semi-heat acclimated all year round, just because of the volume of training they do that keeps their body hot. So I would say once you've got a feel for it, the best thing to do usually is to go for an intensive period of really monitoring this and getting a feel for it. And then you probably have some reliable benchmark figures to go back to. Okay.
And in terms of the sweat sodium composition or concentration, what sort of variations are we talking about there? And can you describe how to work with that and take that into account when planning racing and training?
Well, definitely, that's a huge one. So where we might see a 4 or 5-fold variance in sweat rates, we see up to a 10 or 11-fold difference in sodium composition. So we've sweat tested athletes who are losing only 200 milligrams of sodium per litre of sweat, and we've seen some that are losing over 2,000 milligrams of sodium per litre of sweat. And as you know, and as some people who are listening will probably know, my own experiences with this, I lose about 1.8, 1.9 grams, or 1,800 to 1,900 milligrams of sodium per litre. That's what led me to really start investigating this area, because I had such terrible problems being someone with a relatively high sweat rate, but also a high sodium loss. and that is the one that really affects predominantly the composition of the type of drink or the amount of salt you might need to take during an extended race or training session. And to give you an idea of the bandwidth of that, we do definitely see on the lowest end with people who have low sweat rates and low sodium excretion rates in their sweat, that they can often do even relatively long endurance events in the heat with very light or almost close to no sodium supplementation whatsoever. But on the other end of the scale, we see people who are having to take 1.5, 1.6 grams of sodium per hour through an Ironman in order to continue to perform in good shape. So the bandwidth on that is huge, and that's a part that we obviously work increasingly closely with athletes to help them figure out.
And how do you do that? What is the way to figure out what your sodium losses and sodium concentration in the sweat is?
Basically, two different ways. You've got the good old-fashioned trial and error way, where you try to use your intuition, or there's a free online sweat test guide on our website. You can answer some questions, and it points you towards whether you're likely to lose, a low amount, a medium amount, or a high amount of sodium in your sweat, and then we can give you some parameters to start playing around in. But the more accurate way of doing it, if you have access to it, is we do have you can have a sweat test, which involves us taking a sweat sample and analysing the sodium concentration, and that figure seems to be pretty stable within an individual. So that can be just a one-time test, and that sort of puts a marker in the sand and lets you know whether your losses are low, moderate, high, or very high, and then we can start a bit more refined trial and error off the back of that to then build up to a solution.
Mm. Do you have any numbers in terms of accuracy of your free online sweat tests? Like how close do you get with those estimates to what the actual sweat loss if tested with the device is?
Yeah, we've correlated it against some of the results from sweat testing. And what was interesting was there's the main thing that shone through was that athletes who have higher sweat sodium losses tended to be able to use the questionnaire they knew their bodies and had an inkling that they were losing more salt. So the questionnaire was very accurate at letting them know that. It was a bit less, it works potentially less well with people lower down the scale, but ultimately, that's almost what we'd expect, because those at the higher end are the ones for whom this is the most impactful thing, and they've noticed things about their performance in the heat, or they've noticed things about the way they see salt stains on their skin after training and racing that are strong indicators that they're losing more. So the online sweat test we would never claim that it's perfect, but it's a very good starting point if this is something you want to investigate.
Yeah. If you see like serious salt stains on your skin or on your clothing after training, what is that an indication of? Do you have an idea? Does that mean that you're probably above 1,000 milligrams or even above 1,500 milligrams? Do you have any idea so that listeners can perhaps correlate their experiences with a number?
It's very hard to put a number on it, and I'd be doing as both a disservice if I tried to, I think, because two of the factors that make a huge difference in that are your sweat rate and also the environmental conditions. Because if it's very, very hot and dry, you can sweat quite a lot, and your sweat evaporates very quickly and tends to leave much more of a visible salt residue than if it's hot and humid. So you could be losing more potentially in heat and humidity, but it wouldn't show up quite as much on your skin and clothing because that area remains, damp a lot of the time. And the way I always, this is always re-emphasized to me when I go to, because I often go to Arizona and Florida in February to work with teams in baseball spring training. In Arizona, I'll go running and it's hot and dry, and I come back from a run and I'm pretty dry, but I'm caked in salt. Whereas I go running in Florida and I come back from a run and I'm just dripping and there's no visible salt marks. So I think, in honesty, it depends a little bit on the environment. And we've got a blog on our website now, which is, all about estimating whether you're losing a lot of salt in your sweat or not. And that might be a useful one to link in the show notes for people to read about in more depth here, because I think that's a very good question. And ultimately, the great thing about being an endurance athlete and doing lots of training and racing is that you get to know your body very well. And if you attend to the right cues, I think you can get quite good at tuning into this particular aspect of your physiology if you're pointed in the right direction.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and I also do notice that now training in Finland that the amount of salt stains that I get seems pretty extreme compared to in Portugal, where the climate is more humid, being right next to the Atlantic. So I have a personal experience of exactly what you're saying as well. So I think that we'll put the links to those blog posts about estimating both your sodium content and your sweat rate, and of course the calculator in the show notes, so people can go and have a bit of a more of a look at that. And of course we'll link to your previous episode, or one of those, the first one, where we really covered all of these aspects in detail. So we don't need to go into this particular topic in much more detail right now. The next thing that I wanted to discuss instead is a question that comes up a lot, and it's about how to combine your energy, your electrolytes, and your fluid. And we talked about this before, but if you can give your take on this again, and perhaps even play devil's advocate for the other approaches that you see recommended as well, because it's not necessarily a black and white answer.
Yeah, for sure. I think predominantly, and if we have to be clear about who we're talking about here, but my primary interest in all of this, fueling and hydrating for endurance performance is, I think, skewed towards experiences for long and hot events. So when I say long and hot events, I'm talking about, half in triathlon, half Ironman or above normally, and normally in anything above kind of 20 degrees Celsius. So that is the area in which I'm relatively convinced that for the majority of people, using a strategy which involves separating as much of your fueling from your hydration requirements is the smart way to go. And that's because there's a lot of evidence, both anecdotal and scientific, to promote the fact that, lighter hypotonic as opposed to isotonic or hypertonic. So hypotonic drinks with lots of electrolytes in and a little bit of carbohydrate or no carbohydrate are absorbed and can rehydrate you much, much quicker than thicker, more carbohydrate-based drinks, which may deliver energy as well, but slow gastric emptying and slow absorption of fluids. And there are always exceptions to that rule when I hear about people who do entire half Ironmans and Ironmans on liquid calories. But in the heat, there's so many things which challenge your hydration, apart from the fact that on the obvious ones, like your sweat rates go up and so you lose more, so you just need to hydrate more anyway. You also decrease blood flow to the gut, and it's just been proven time and time again that you absorb fluids less well in those extreme heat conditions when you're working hard. So doing everything you can to decouple fluid consumption and electrolyte consumption from energy intake is smart, because you're going to want to drink a lot more than you would on, say, a cold day, but your calorie requirement is going to be similar. So if you can get your calories from more solid sources, bars, gels, blocks, whatever your preferred methodology is, and then top up with water and electrolyte tablets or electrolyte capsules or hypertonic electrolyte drinks, then I think you put yourself in the best position to be able to absorb the maximum amount of both that's possible without gastric upset, which is ultimately the aim of the game.
And how does this fact about the heat in the environment affecting the absorption rate of the fluid? How does that come into play on the fluid, or on the energy side of things with the more solid foods? Like, is that impacted at all? Is it more difficult to absorb the energy from something like a gel or a bar when it's hot compared to when it's cold?
Definitely. It's basically more challenging to absorb anything, fluids, calories, the lot, when it's very hot. And I think that's principally because the blood flow gets diverted, away from the gut, and it gets pushed towards the skin to cool you down. And you also end up contracting your blood volume a lot more quickly because you dehydrate more quickly. So the whole thing is sort of more challenging for the body, and therefore absorption rates are slowed down. The reason I think that it's better to separate those calories from those fluids and salts is because if you eat solids and they sit in the stomach, then they can be dripped, the energy from them. The body's quite clever, and it can pass the energy through at a rate that's compatible with its current situation, rather than just putting a liquid in, which kind of, in a large volume, an isotonic liquid like a traditional kind of sugary sports drink just cascade through the stomach into the gut and can overwhelm the gut, and absorption can get very messed up, and you get that horrible sort of bloated, gassy, sicky feeling that most athletes have experienced if they've done a long race in the heat and drunk too much of a traditional type sports drink.
And in terms of the new things that we see on the market, like things like the Maurten and Science in Sport Beta Fuel are becoming quite popular, that are very concentrated energy drinks. What's your opinion on them, and how do they fit into the picture?
I think the latest evidence on those is that they obviously claim to be able to deliver a higher amount of carbohydrate in a smaller amount of liquid than was possible using a traditional sort of sports drink composition. So they use they call it a hydrogel or something like that, where the acids in the stomach react with the contents of the drink and sort of turn it into a gel-like state so that it can move through the digestive system more easily, or sort of almost like disguised from the gut, as it were. And I know that there was a study done. I think it was published in 2019. It was probably undertaken before then, and they found basically that there was maybe some improvement in gastric emptying and of these carbohydrate drinks as compared with a normal carbohydrate drink matched without the hydrogel, but whether that it was unclear as to whether that actually resulted in faster uptake in the gut and any performance difference. So the jury, I think, is still out as to whether it's an actual meaningful performance benefit, even if it does achieve the first step of that process, which is slightly faster transit through the first part of the digestive system.
Okay, yeah. And then another product that I wanted to ask about, we don't have it on the list of questions actually, but I just recently had a conversation with this company. It's UCAN Superstarch. So they have this slower absorbing a drink that their idea is to give more of a stable energy response or glucose response in the blood and stable energy release. Do you know anything about that and how that might work?
Yeah, I believe that the theory behind that is exactly almost as you've described it, that the carbohydrate's broken down more slowly and released more slowly, and so gives a slower release of energy over a period of time rather than a spike. I've got no personal experience of using it, but I know of athletes who are very keen and committed to that idea. I actually think that these things are, a lot of these different methodologies for delivering carbohydrate or whatever we're talking about they get blown a little bit out of proportion in terms of the basics you've always got to fall back on are that while you're exercising, if you're exercising for a long duration, especially in the heat, you need to deliver water, salt, and calories of some sort to sustain the body. And largely, as long as you're sensible about how the rate at which they go in, so it's compatible with absorption and uptake, as well as being compatible with the rate of energy use or sweating or whatever else, or proportional to those at least, then your body's pretty clever at sorting itself out and tends to move whatever it needs to move through the system. And as long as you get the proportion of those three things about right, you'll feel pretty good and you'll continue to exercise well. The biggest mistake a lot of athletes make is not getting the proportion of those things right. It's not so much what particular brand of XYZ they use, it's just getting the fundamentals right that's the problem.
So how do they skew it incorrectly? What are the typical mistakes that occur there specifically?
A massive one is like drinking a isotonic sports drink, because they're often available on course, and without singling them out in a bad way, Gatorade is available at most of the North American Ironman events, and Gatorade Endurance or normal Gatorade, it's a very, very carbohydrate rich drink, 6-7% carbohydrate. If athletes are relying on that predominantly for hydration and then also topping up with gels and energy bars, what they're doing there is massively overdosing with carbohydrate and underdoing electrolytes and fluids. And that is a sure recipe for gastric upset. And that happens, especially with more novice athletes, that happens time and time again, because our perception in our head is that a drink bottle is a drink. It's liquid. But at the end of the day, that's almost more fuel than it is drink. And then you add more fuel on top of that, and what you end up with is a horrible sticky mess in your stomach that just doesn't go anywhere and makes you feel quite obnoxious. And I would say that's probably one of the biggest mistakes. Another huge mistake, and I found this working with even a few elite age group athletes in the last 12 months, is that not having an appreciation of what the kinds of approximate amounts of fluids, salts and calories or carbohydrates you might need per hour are. And it's very much having a kind of hit and hope approach and a non-methodical approach to iterating the way forward. So I've been working with an athlete who's doing phenomenally well in age group triathlon, winning and setting course records at North American events in 70.3. But the first few races was probably literally scraping by and taking 30 or 40% of the calories and fluids that common sense or common scientific rationale would say that he needed during those events. And he was very tough and very fit and just hanging in there on the run. But when we adjusted that into a ballpark that was much more plausible, it was dramatic, the effect that had on the last third of his race. And so I think just the level of ignorance of, not really understanding, what's a large amount of carbs or a reasonable amount of carbs to take per hour, what's a large amount of fluid or a reasonable amount of fluid to take per hour, and so on. Just having those numbers in your head is a hugely important step.
What do you typically recommend? Is it the typical 60 to 90 grams, or do you say 1 gram per kilogram body weight, or how do you work with that number?
I usually start around the sort of 60. And it depends a bit on the athlete's size, so we scale it a bit by size. But a lot of it is more of a feel factor than a grams per kilo, because we'll tend to base it off of the 60 to 90 grams per hour is a good window for a lot of faster moving athletes. But we'll also pitch it towards what they're currently doing, because most athletes are doing something, even if they don't know what it is. We can reverse engineer what they're taking in by getting them to record it and just looking at it. And for instance, with this athlete I was talking about, he was probably only consuming 25 to 30 grams of carbs per hour. So we didn't suddenly triple that. We doubled it to start with, to pull it up to the lower end. Whereas if he'd have already been taking 40 or 50, I might have been more aggressive and wound it up a bit further. So I would always sort of move the needle in the direction of that, for carbohydrate, 60 to 90 grams. But at the same time, trying to take into account, okay, what's this person doing at the moment? Because we want to make the smallest possible change that might positively influence performance, rather than, going completely the other way.
Yeah, because if you go too far, then perhaps that kind of scares the athlete off of doing a change that is needed. So it's better to take small steps.
The analogy would be, you've got someone who comes to you, if you're a bike fitter, you've got someone who comes to you and who's been riding with their bike saddle way, way too low, but they've obviously adapted to it to an extent and aren't performing horrendously. Rather than, move it up to the highest possible point you think they might want the saddle at, you're probably just going to go halfway, and get them to adapt to that. And then maybe you might go another bit again, but you need to do that incrementally. And again, I think that's a big failing of a lot of athletes, is that they have these big pendulum swings in what if a nutritional or hydration approach is deemed to have not worked at a particular race, there's a big tendency to wholesale change it for the next one, rather than just make small intelligent tweaks that might push it in one direction or another. Ultimately, you can have success if you radically change your approach, but it's very hard to pin down exactly what made the difference there, if a difference occurs. Whereas if you incrementally move things, you get a bit more sensitivity about what's actually having an effect. And I think ultimately you become a better athlete as a result of going through that process.
So talking of radical changes, I think that it's also kind of a small little trend that we're seeing, that some athletes are really experimenting with, and somewhat successfully in many cases, I would say, using very high amounts of carbohydrates. So we're talking 100 to 120 grams per hour, and which is above what is typically cited as the research-backed amount of carbohydrate that can be absorbed. I've also heard, I haven't read this, so this is just something that I heard from somewhere, and I haven't looked it up. But I've heard that there is a little bit of new evidence about perhaps fructose can be absorbed in larger quantities than we previously believed, which might explain why you could go up higher than 90 grams per hour. Do you know anything about this? Or if not, just in general, what are your thoughts on those high amounts of carbohydrate intake?
I haven't read anything very recently about, the sort of carbohydrate intake with fructose specifically, but I know obviously all of the research that's been done around the different carbohydrate types and blends that work in unison to the classic one being the glucose fructose ratio, which allows for a higher absorption than one or the other at a time. So it's well established that getting the blend of carbohydrates right can influence absorption in the right direction. I think though, honestly, with the high end figures like you're quoting, like over 100 grams per hour, I've definitely talked to a lot of, we do a fair amount of work now with professional cyclists in the peloton, and some of those guys can eat, if what they're telling me is true. I've not seen it with my own eyes, but these guys are intelligent and they know what they do, so I'm inclined to believe them. There are definitely people there who are telling me that they will, for very intense periods during long, hard events, will eat more than 100 grams of carbohydrate per hour. And potentially, I think, like any other physiological factor, if the sweet spot window for a lot of people is 60 to 90, it's almost certain that there'll be outliers either side. And so something north of 100 grams per hour is not outlandish for maybe, people who are either adapted or just genetically predisposed to being able to uptake a little bit more energy. And maybe it's something that you can train, to an extent if you're doing it on a regular basis. And I think pro cycling is a really interesting place to go looking for trends like that, because unlike professional triathletes and things who can race relatively frequently, pro cyclists race so much. They do so many back-to-back days of racing and different days of racing within a year, that their bodies become exquisitely attuned to eating and absorbing calories on the bike, that and they work at a very high intensity a lot of the time, that they're a good place to go looking for evidence around that. So it's certainly something which I'm keeping an eye out for as I'm working with these people.
Yeah, and for in training, even like a 6-hour ride is something that is a completely normal Monday kind of ride for them. So if you just leave it up to the time period between your ride and sleeping 8 hours per night, then you have only so much time that you can replenish your energy stores, even if you would go by the traditional 60 to 90 grams. So I think it makes total sense that when you're training that much, that you try to go harder, because you just need to survive the training, essentially.
Exactly, yeah. And I think the danger with that sort of stuff as well is when we start to hear about, so-and-so is taking 120 grams of carb an hour, and the classic thing is then you just get people copying it. And that can be detrimental, because obviously if you can't tolerate that, that's twice as much as a lot of people can tolerate. And clearly that, when you start taking twice as much as some people can tolerate, that's going to have detrimental effects. So it's important just to always, have people love to copy what high performing or pro athletes do, and in some ways it's good. There are some great things to learn from them, some good aspirations to look to. But on the flip side, it can be more productive sometimes to actually be realistic about your own situation and abilities, and focus on yourself as an individual.
Definitely, and if we're taking an Ironman as an example, there's a massive difference in energy consumption, energy needs if you're riding at 250 watts versus 150 watts, which could be the case even for two males of the same size, just depending on the fitness abilities of the two athletes. So then obviously the energy needs are going to be very different. Plus,
definitely. I mean,
plus the relative intensity of exercise as well will influence how much carbs you're using. Somebody who's more well-trained can go at a higher relative intensity, but then they might be using more carbs than somebody who is going at a just basically your all day long kind of pace, because that's the safe way for them to get through their Ironman if they're just doing it to complete the event.
I was going to say exactly the same thing. The guys and girls that are at the front who are really redlining are treading a tightrope. They're going really, really hard and burning up to the sort of maximum energy, the rate of energy burn, or the output that they can sustain for that period. So they are treading a really fine line, and obviously having to really maximize that calorie absorption to keep them on that red line. But if you are, even a few percentage points below that, and haven't got the fitness to carry that kind of intensity throughout the whole duration, then you might find that proportionally your energy needs are significantly lower as well, because as you were saying, you may be able to rely a bit more on fat adaptation and fat burning, in which case, your level of consumption will be significantly lower.
Yeah.
So it is complicated, and sometimes the downside of having these kind of expansive conversations about it is it can lead to a bit of confusion for people, because people often want to know, what do I need to do? And I think the temptation is therefore, to offer out generic guidelines, but the reality still is that there's that level of individual experimentation, and I think it's about people becoming very good estimators for what they might need in their situation, and then having the confidence to play around in that zone that within those guardrails that actually makes for a good outcome. And that's where a lot of our education efforts around what people should be doing for hydration and stuff are starting to go. It's about getting people in the right zone and then letting them figure out the fine details, because there's nobody better placed than to do that than they are.
Yeah, so very practically, you don't want anybody to just go and look up the guidelines, and then the race day is the first time that they do it. They should go out and simulate race day in some way. Not obviously doing a full Ironman in training, but doing longer training days, perhaps running off a long bike ride as well, and seeing how the starting point that they might find works for them, and then adjust based on that and train it again, and making sure that they have the energy, but also they're not causing GI distress or anything like that.
Definitely. It's all about, do those things, do those experiments, record what you did, record the results, and then based on the outcome of that, use intelligence or use other people as resources. That's what we love to hear from athletes who've done a bit of that trial and error. They can email us at hello@precisionhydration.com, and we're answering those emails all the time. Well, I've tried this in training and this was the outcome, and then what do you suggest? And when we're working with someone like that, it's really gratifying to be able to help them push the things in the right direction. But the way it works best is if they've got a good and accurate record of what they've been doing and what the outcomes are, and then you can sort of strongly advise on what a sensible iterative next step is from there.
Yeah. What's your opinion on doing metabolic testing to get a more accurate picture of your carbohydrate and fat oxidation rates, and then using that information for planning your race hydration and nutrition strategy?
I think that it's like any other tool, that if it's used excessively rigidly, it can be counterproductive, because you'll get figures on your best fat burning zones and what kind of intensity of exercise tips you into burning too much carbohydrate or whatever. And I've seen athletes that are kind of blinded by those numbers, and it puts artificial limiters in their head if it's heart rate figures or power figures or speed figures that are set, and they kind of get too much belief in the solidity of those zones. I think on the other side, though, if it's used intelligently to help inform, and that's the kind of testing where if you can do it regularly and repeatedly, you can see changes in your metabolism and changes in your effectively your fitness and efficiency level, then it can be very useful in guiding what you do, but it shouldn't dictate what you do.
Yeah, definitely. I think there is this something that my coach David Tilbury Davis pointed out to me, that in terms of like repeated consecutive day VO2 max testing, there can be as or a normal day-to-day variation is 5% in the measured VO2 max, and that obviously carries over to all sub-maximal intensities as well. And you might, being rigidly attached to any number is never a good idea. But yeah, it can give a good starting point and some guidelines to then work from.
Yeah, for sure.
And you mentioned already training the gut. Have you read the research and or just from talking to athletes and helping athletes with hydration and nutrition? What's your opinion on how trainable it is to be able to take on more fluid and more carbohydrate? And because that's something that, especially for the athletes that are going for the longer distance races, could be critical if you're somebody who really isn't tolerating these things very well as it is.
Yeah, I think that the element of the gut being trainable, especially as you transition from relatively novice athlete to becoming more experienced and moving up into longer distances, is extremely trainable. You see some big differences. I think as you get closer, like with most physiological parameters, the closer you get to being, experienced and elite, the less influence that training can have, because you've already as you've built up to achieving that level, you've gone through a lot of those adaptations and changes. So I think it's important for athletes who are, especially, the classic one in triathlon is the transition from, say, Olympic and half Ironman racing up to full Ironman racing. I think that really reinforcing a sensible hydration nutrition strategy in your longer training sessions and races that build you up towards an Ironman should be a priority. And an example of that would be, we definitely encourage some athletes who are moving from half Ironman to full Ironman to adopt a slightly more aggressive fueling and hydration plan on the bike in a half Ironman to start to prepare them for the levels that they might need to consume in an Ironman. So I think that, it should, in answer to your question, it is trainable, and it should definitely be factored in as a fourth or fifth discipline, if you like, when you're moving up into longer distances, because at Olympic distance, it's as long as you're hydrated and fueled when you start and listen to your body, you're going to do fine. If you at half Ironman, you can implode a little bit with poor nutrition and hydration, but in Ironman it is as critical, as the nutritional component is as critical as the swim, the bike, or the run on its own. And so you've got to treat it as such and sort of focus on practicing it, developing it, and getting it right.
How long might it take to develop that, and how often should you do it in training? Let's say you're a typical athlete that are transitioning from half distance to full distance. You might be training, let's say, in the region of 12 to 16 hours per week, and probably do a longer bike ride on the weekend and a longer run, and then you have some bike rides in the an hour and a half sort of time range on weekdays and 1 hour runs. What would your advice be for how often to practice taking on your sort of fueling and hydration? And can you elaborate on that? Because I assume that it's not going to be enough to just do a couple of half-distance tune-up races and just go aggressive in those, and then that's going to help you do the same thing in the full Ironman. You're going to have to do it in training quite a bit as well.
Absolutely. I think the key ones would obviously be any long brick sessions that you do, especially those which are having large elements of simulated race intensity or getting close to race intensity, because that's the best case scenario for training, for practicing those elements. If you're someone who's going to race my big preference on testing these things out is under this heat and pressure of competition. So factoring races in, if you can, that allow you the opportunity to do it as much as possible is really, really important. But if the situation dictates that might only be 1 or 2 occasions, then I would definitely look at organising some slightly more, maybe some slightly longer and harder training sessions than would otherwise be warranted, specifically to shake that aspect of your performance down. Because if you go into race day with that nutrition and hydration plan a little bit untested, you are leaving a pretty significant factor to chance.
But you don't think that you necessarily need to to practice that same sort of hydration and nutrition uptake rate in your weekday training sessions, for example, those 1 to 1.5 hour sessions, because I think that that's something that I remember Jesse Kropelnicki uses as a strategy with his athlete. They actually, even for very short 30 to 45 minute sessions, so definitely going on the extreme end of things there, but they all the time, if they're working towards a long distance, they are practicing taking on hydration and nutrition. What's your thought on that strategy?
I think that's well, how do I feel about that? I think that it probably isn't going to do any harm. Whether it's going to be substantially effective in what it's going to add, I honestly don't know. I think one advantage to paying a lot of attention to your fueling and hydration in quite an aggressive way during your, say, let's call them your midweek training sessions or whatever these 90-minute, hour 90-minute sessions is, that theoretically that should help you with recovery from those sessions, because big part of the recovery from midweek training, especially if you are an age group or leading a busy life and all the rest of it, is making sure you're adequately fueled and hydrated. So if you make that a priority, I don't see a particular downside to it. But I would still stand by the fact that you're going to get the majority of the benefits, I would imagine, by doing this in those kind of longer, harder sessions, which are more simulated. Certainly that's where you're going to take the most learnings from them. Adaptively, he could well be onto a point there, but for me, the priority would be still around making sure that you're doing them right in those long sessions. And I say that because I see so many athletes who, for instance, aren't prepared to really go to the nth degree of really trialing their race nutrition plan in those key sessions. They'll plan those key sessions, but then they'll use whatever energy bars, drinks, tablets, whatever it is they've got in their cupboard at the time, rather than actually trying to simulate what they're going to do in the race. And I think that level of detail, you wouldn't sort of put an old, different bike saddle on your bike when you go out and do these rides. So why you wouldn't eat the same type of gels, drink the same type of drinks or whatever, to me is madness. But I see that quite frequently.
Yeah, it's you only have so many opportunities to train that. If that's not something that you're going to do much more than like once per week would even be high, because you lose quite a few weeks to like off season and maybe some recovery weeks and things like that. So yeah, it makes sense what you're saying.
I mean, to give you an example on that, James and I from PH, we did the Otelo swim run worlds last year, and that's an 8-hour race or 9-hour race for us, and we went to a pretty significant extent on some of our longer training sessions, actually going through the different types of gels that we could carry, and even trying the individual flavors and stuff to make sure that we were totally happy with using them on the move, how easy the packets opened, what the flavor was like, how they made our stomachs feel, because we knew that getting that part of that race right was critical. So when we carried the stuff with us on the day, we were confident that we tried and tested all of the different components of it. And be that a marginal gain, if you want to call it that, I think it was a significant one in my head, at least, going into the race, going, I know that I've got this nutrition hydration plan nailed, which was important, because for that race I was going into it, in aerobic and muscle endurance terms, relatively undertrained, off the training volume. So that was an area where I felt, we could focus on getting it right. And if I look back, and a lot of these things that I'm saying as well, I look back and these are learnings from earlier in my career when I was racing Ironman, and I wasn't as attentive to those details. And I do believe that meant that I came unstuck, because I was a lot fitter than I am now, but I definitely maybe abused that fitness used that fitness to mask some lack of detailed preparation in some of these other areas.
Yeah, that's a great example, and makes a lot of sense. You're mentioning the gels and the different tastes. That brought up something to my mind that I wanted to ask, and that's there are some gels that are isotonic, whereas most would be hypertonic. Do you think that is an advantage in terms of absorption of the energy in those gels? Or what do you think about that?
I think it definitely is if fluid availability is limited. So we used a lot of those in the O2Low racing where you can't get regular access to drinks. I think if you're going to have them in a triathlon where you've got regular access to bottles of water on the bike and stuff, then it's less of an issue because you just take an extra half a mouthful of water and you've effectively got the same kind of mixture then. But if you're in a situation where fluids are limited, I think those lighter, thinner gels are fantastic, and I really like them. They tend to go down a lot easier, especially in the heat.
So here's a follow-up on that then, because if hypertonic and even isotonic fluids absorb less well than hypotonic fluids, if you have a gel, let's say a hypertonic gel, and then you have some water with it, wouldn't those added together be kind of like a hypertonic drink? But are they sort of seen differently by the body, or what do you think about that?
It's a good question, and I think ultimately whatever goes down the hatch ends up in your stomach and ends up being mixed up. Now, in my experience, solid foods, obviously, when you eat a solid food, it forms a bolus in the stomach, and is then the stomach works it all together, and then it's digested and slowly at a rate that the stomach wants to push it through into the gut. With a semi-solid like a gel, in my experience, from an athlete perspective, not from doing anything in the lab, they seem to behave more closely to the feel that you get when you eat a solid food rather than a straight up liquid. Rather than just drinking a very, very light mixture of carbohydrate and fluid. Honestly, I don't know from a physiology perspective and a scientific perspective what is happening in the stomach precisely when you add those two things together. But in my experience, it seems to be processed a little bit better, a little bit differently if you have gels and a hypertonic drink as opposed to an isotonic drink per se. And I think possibly what's going on there is nothing so much on the physical level as the fact that if you're listening to your body and you're taking energy when you need energy and fluids when you need fluids, you're listening to your body's needs, and you're topping that system up and giving it what it needs at the time that it needs it, rather than just every time you open your mouth it's heavy dose of carbohydrate and a dose of fluid, if that makes sense. Yeah. So that's where on a hot day, you might find that you're reaching for the drink bottle 3 times more often than you are reaching for a gel. On a cold day, the ratio might be reversed.
Yeah.
And I think it's allowing you to have that flexibility of fine-tuning the mixture that makes the difference rather than what the physical mixture is when it ends up in your stomach.
So I think we should just clarify here that when we talked about hydration and electrolytes and energy, and you mentioned that your preference is that energy should be solid foods, gels would be in this context classified as solid foods, correct?
Yes, yeah, I put them in that category. Yeah. And I know that that's not necessarily everyone's view, but for the purposes of this, then yeah, that's how they seem to get treated, especially because if you took them in isolation, they are very, very hypertonic, and apart from the more isotonic ones, and therefore I think the body treats them as a digestible food. Mm.
So another topic that we have on our list here is wearables and the monitoring of hydration status, and this is something that I know absolutely nothing about, but you said that there are some developments in this area, so can you elaborate on that?
Very much so. There's a number of companies, and we've been in dialogue with several of them. And I think it's not going to be too long. Probably this year, next year, you're going to start to see prototypes and maybe even some commercially available products that are going to be able to look at sweat rate and sweat sodium loss and maybe even other parameters in sweat in real time. And I think, notwithstanding whether the accuracy of these things can be really firmly validated, if it can be, there's huge potential for everyone to start to learn a lot more about what changes in sweat loss, sweat sodium composition, all these kind of things happen over extended periods of time, and then what effect that has on performance and what influence that might have on intake. So I think basically what's going to happen is once those wearables start to be used by a lot of people, we're going to have a sudden influx and lots of interesting data, which we can then correlate against different hydration nutrition plans and performance outcomes and accelerate the learning in that space massively. Because if you think about what happens at the moment is we can estimate sweat rates, we can estimate sodium loss and all these other things during exercise, but they're based on snapshot readings taken at different times. If we can actually monitor what's going on in real time, we can really map that against what happens in the body as performance is either maintained or improves or deteriorates. I think that you could really start to see what effect changing hydration and nutrition plans could have on the fly, and that'd be really, really interesting.
So are there some companies already out there that are public about it? They're trying to develop these kinds of products that you could name, or is it?
Yeah, I've seen Gatorade testing their patch in different places. So they've got a sweat monitoring patch, I believe, that is not, they claim is not far away, although it's been not far away from going to market for quite a while now. That appears to be there. And then a handful of others are more from academic institutions and research institutions that seem to be targeting sport alongside, let's say, military and clinical and occupational applications as well, by monitoring lots and lots of parameters in sweat. So there's a number of them, but I think most of them appear to be in a kind of working prototype stage as opposed to being close to a finished commercial product yet with a name.
Yeah, well, we'll just need to watch this space then. And
definitely, yeah.
Are there any other updates that you want to mention in the realm of hydration, or any new research or things that you've found interesting or maybe written about recently, or just that our listeners would find valuable and interesting?
I think we covered one of them, which was that research on the sort of hydrogel stuff, which is very much so called into question whether it's as big a game changer as has been made out. And what I'll do is I will dig out the research paper for you that came out last year, or a link to it if I can to put in the notes, because I think for a lot of people it'd be worth reading that, because whilst I'm definitely a big advocate for kind of innovative technology in that area, and I think that is a really it's still the jury is still out as to how effective it is. I think one of the potential issues with that kind of thing is so much hype gets created around the difference between, say, this hydrogel versus just a dense carbohydrate drink or a normal carbohydrate gel, that it gets blown out of proportion in people's minds how much difference it makes. So for us, we've decided that going forward, the moment focus on the education basics around hydration nutrition is actually probably far more important for the average person, be it a little bit less sexy and a little bit less marketable. It is ultimately probably where most people can find the biggest performance gains. So one of the things that we've done, I know we've sent an invite to you to have a look at it in the past, is we've put an endurance hydration training course, or it's called the Science of Endurance Hydration. It's a video course that you can do on the Training Peaks Thinkific platform, and that would be something which I'd encourage some of your listeners to have a look at. They can access it via our website or directly via the Training Peaks platform. We can probably put a link in for you to find it, but that's a course they can sign up to do of 8 or 9 lectures and some workshops and things that really take you through what I would say are a lot of the fundamentals around hydration for endurance exercise. And so for us, we're trying to look the other way to where a lot of the rest of the industry is going, which is whiz bang sort of marketable but potentially hype fueled new ideas, to actually saying education around the basics is probably going to help more athletes in the long run.
Yeah, definitely. I recently did a Q&A episode where I covered 2 devices. It was the Halo Neuroscience brain stimulator, and the other one was, what's it called again? Oh, the sleep tracker that I'm totally blanking on right now. Sleep and continuous HRV monitoring. Whoop.
I think I know which one you mean. Yeah, Whoop.
Yeah. So like around those, especially the Whoop, I think there's been a lot of hype built up, and it's the same with, not like necessarily wanting to bash those two companies, but just in general, like when something new comes up, there's typically this hype curve where at first it's built up to be way more important than it actually is, and then it goes through this trough of disillusionment that I think people call it in this hype curve model. And
yes,
then,
I've heard. Yeah. Yeah.
And then eventually it settles at its rightful place in where it should be in terms of the importance. But yeah, I think you're absolutely spot on there that it's very unlikely that something new is going to come up that is a game changer that revolutionizes anything. It's more incremental steps that we're seeing, and incremental improvements in our knowledge about how things are changing, and that's and certainly I think that different formulations can be a part of that incremental change, but it's not going to be a game changer, or because it's so unlikely that anything is going to be that, because it just doesn't really happen like that. It doesn't work like that.
No, it's funny. I think the athletes often expect or hope for, because we all want to improve, and we all want to be, better than we are or better than we were, and are prepared to put quite a lot of effort into that, especially with training and planning and all the rest of it. But there's that sort of enduring hope that there will be that thing out there that takes us to that, to really leapfrogs us to the next level. And actually there's been something like that, hasn't there, in the last couple of years, which has been the Nike Vaporfly shoes and the 4% shoes and whatever, which do appear to really elevate a lot of people's performance by a considerable amount. And it seems that basically all you have to do is, be prepared to pay $250 for the shoes, and then you've got that performance jump. But that's really rare, isn't it? That's I almost can't think of anything else in recent memory that's made as big a difference as that, So focusing on those simple things, whilst it's not sexy, and it requires a little bit of grind and a little bit of boring, back and forth iteration. If people are serious about improving, then I think that's a good place to go looking.
Yeah. All right. We'll have lots of links in the show notes that we'll put together after this episode. So they will all be available for the listeners to go and have a look at. And I'm interested in reading the paper on the hydrogels as well. So I might do a Q&A or something about that in the not too distant future, and see the specifics of what that paper mentioned. But Andy, it's been great talking to you. Any final words for the listeners?
Oh no, I'm just really pleased to be still back on, and it's fantastic for the whole of the triathlon community that your podcast is just keeping growing from strength to strength. So we're, Precision Hydration, I think we've been involved from quite early on in that journey, but it's been fantastic to be part of that, and we genuinely wish you continued success with it, because we think you provide an excellent service to the community.
Same to you, absolutely. Same to you. Thank you, and I'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Michael. See you soon.
I hope that you enjoyed that interview. I always really, really enjoy talking to Andy and hearing what he has to say. He's very knowledgeable, as I'm sure you gathered from that interview and from the previous appearances he's made on the podcast. We mentioned quite a lot of resources, a few blog posts, a few research papers, and everything is linked to in the show notes and the episode description. In the next episode, or next Monday, I should say, on Thursday we have a Q&A as usual, but on Monday I will interview a world-class triathlon coach that I'm sure most of you have heard about. The one thing is that I haven't quite decided who it will be, because I have multiple of these world-class coaches lined up. So it could be, for example, US Olympian and now elite coach Ryan Bolton, or it could be Philip Saip, who is coaching Sebastian Kienle and Laura Philipp, among others. Or maybe Faris Al-Sultan, who is, of course, a former Ironman world champion and an Ironman world champion coach now as well on 2 occasions with Patrick Lange. So stay subscribed. The show must go on, and there's plenty of great episode coming your way. If you want to check out any of the training plans, coaching, or other services that we offer, go and check out scientifictriathlon.com, and you can read more about those products and services there. And finally, thank you to our sponsors, Precision Hydration, that you can find on precisionhydration.com. And you can get 15% off your order with the promo code THATTriathlonShow15. And actually, one thing that I forgot to mention is that we also have a discount code, a 50% discount code for the Training Peaks University course that Andy mentioned. And it is available in the episode description and in the show notes of this episode. It's a bit complicated, so I won't read it out here. But you can find it in your podcast player or on the website in the links and resources section. And thank you to Roka that you can find on roka.com. Check out their wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, and high-performance eyewear, and get 20% off your order with the promo code TTS20. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.